Welcome back to Red and Blue. In 2018, then Congressman Ron DeSantis was the underdog in the Republican primary for Florida governor. In August of that year, CBS News Miami investigative reporter Jim DeFede asked DeSantis about his time serving at the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center as a lawyer for the United States Navy.
So were you interviewing terrorists? Were you a legal advisor?
I was a legal advisor.
For those that were doing...
The things that would happen is, the thing you notice the day you get down there is, for these detainees, the jihad was still ongoing.
Right.
And they would wage jihad any way they can. Now, they're in a facility, so it's limited, but some of the things they would do hunger strikes, and you actually had 3 detainees that committed suicide with hunger strikes. So everything at that time was legal in nature one way or another. So the commander wants to know, well, how do I combat this? So one of the jobs of the legal advisor would be like, hey, you actually can force feed. Here's what you can do. Here's kind of the rules of that.
The United Nations Human Rights Commission has deemed the practice of force-feeding torture. Almost 5 years later, and as a possible 2024 Republican presidential candidate, DeSantis' story has changed slightly, not so much in content, but in emphasis. Here is his exchange with TV host Piers Morgan on his time in Guantanamo.
One of the things they said was that you authorize the use of force-feeding.
That's
some of the
true. Yeah, that's not true. Yeah, any of the stuff that people
just to finish, force-feeding the detainees who were on hunger strike. Was that true?
So I was a junior officer. I didn't have authority to authorize anything. There may have been a commander that would have done feeding if someone was going to die, but that was not something that I would have even had authority to do.
So that's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
Joining us now is CBS News Miami investigative reporter Jim DeFede. Jim, what is your takeaway from the 2 sound bites our audience just heard?
Well, I think you're right. I don't think they're necessarily in conflict with each other. I think what's really is, it's the context. Sort of when I sat down with him in 2018, he was a little bit more expansive. Here, he was trying to knock down the idea that he had anything to do with the force feeding of folks by really relying on the word authorizing. And at no time has anyone ever suggested that Ron DeSantis was the one authorizing the policy towards force feeding of detainees at Guantanamo. You know, the way I like to always describe it is Ron DeSantis was essentially a first-year associate in a very, very large law firm, being the JAG Corps. He was 27 years old in 2006 when he served in Guantanamo. And so he was simply there implementing policies established by others. But it's interesting when you hear him now talking to Tucker Carlson, sort of remove even a lot of that context and almost make it seem as if he was nowhere to be found when it came to this.
And clearly in that interview with you in 2018, it seemed as if, to me, Jim, he was leaning into the idea that it was important that he be a legal advisor, that he was providing that legal advice, and that it was being carried out.
I think you're absolutely right. The other thing that I noticed a lot between the 2018 interview and the interview that it will air later on Fox with Piers Morgan is that you know, Ron DeSantis used the phrase force feed and force feeding. In the Piers Morgan interview, he only refers to it now as feeding or to feed the detainees. And I think that's an interesting thing. Now, there's another interesting parallel here to me. In 2018, Ron DeSantis was sort of introducing himself. At that point, he was still relatively unknown statewide. He was waging a campaign. He had been a congressman for 6 years, and he was sort of introducing himself still. So even his biography, in terms of having served in the military, served in Iraq, served for a period of time at Guantanamo Naval Base, was all relatively new. And it's sort of almost like deja vu all over again. Now, here we are in 2023. He's introducing himself to a national audience, to a worldwide audience, and he's again going through his biography, this time with a few selective edits.
And Jim, we should note that there is nothing wrong with someone in a position as Ron DeSantis was, as a Judge Advocate General for the United States Navy, being gung-ho at one time and then thinking something different about something several years later. Many people have once gone from gung-ho in Guantanamo to reflecting on it differently as the years and the policy and the inability of that policy to achieve certain results has come under scrutiny. And some have reevaluated how good a policy that was in the first place. That's not what we're talking about here. It seems to me there's a larger political conversation is, I mean, among Republican primary and caucus voters, how do you think this is going to land? Because as you and I both recall, I wouldn't say that then candidate Trump won the nomination because he said he was pro-torture, but he certainly didn't lose any momentum over it. And it seems that there's, at minimum, a kind of squeamishness that DeSantis is expressing about that time that he spent in Guantanamo.
No, I agree. And I don't see where this would necessarily hurt him in a Republican primary. I'm not even sure how much of an impact this could have in a general election, because it's also worth noting and remembering that when Barack Obama became president, he also defended the use of force feeding, saying that it was a better alternative to allowing the detainees to die as a result of their hunger strikes. So, you know, this is always very tricky waters when you start wading into what happened in Guantanamo. I think this is just part of the maturation process for DeSantis as he moves onto that national stage. This is an early indication of what the types of questions he's going to be asked. And I would have loved and still would love an opportunity to ask him some follow-up questions, more specifically towards how he would define torture, how he, if he does indeed run and was the commander-in-chief, how he would implement what he saw in Guantanamo and what changes he might make if he was the commander-in-chief moving forward. I think those are important questions that he'll eventually have to answer, you know, and I think that it's going to be fascinating to watch as he moves out onto that stage.
And Jim, you were there in 2018. Is it your perspective that on the simple question of the politics in that Republican primary, this aspect of Ron DeSantis' biography, he wanted to lean into with a certain amount of gusto in order to make him look either more heroic or more active in the war on terrorism, however it was conceived of in that time?
Well, I also think, I mean, let's give him credit, too. Not only did he serve for brief periods of time at Guantanamo, he also served as a legal advisor to SEAL Team 1 in Iraq. So, you know, one of the things that he did lean into heavily in 2018 when he was introducing himself to voters here across the state was his military record, was the fact that he served, he volunteered, not just served, but volunteered after graduating from Harvard Law School. He went undergrad to Yale, Harvard Law School, and then rather than, as he has pointed out, go into some high-paying job that a Harvard-educated lawyer would naturally land into, he went into the military. So he's very proud, and justifiably so, of his time in the military. And I think that we'll hear more and more about that in the days, months, weeks to come.
With all the context we could have asked for, Jim DeFede, thanks so very much.
Thank you.